Well, right now we're turning our attention to the state of terrorism, and only this week the Global Terrorism Index for 2025 was released by the Institute of Economics and Peace, and it does appear that there's been some news to mull over, in that particular report. Some people, they see good things, they also see bad things. I'm going to be speaking this morning with Mr. Kabiru Adamu, who is a global, beg your pardon. Yeah, I know you're going to go global soon, or if you're not global already. Yes, but he's a security expert. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on Sunrise Daily.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
I'd like to know, the Global Terrorism Index is out, and a lot of people have been poring over the pages of this report, and quite a number of them have seen both good things and bad things. Good things in the sense that Nigeria seems to be faring better than it has over the last couple of years, but bad things in the sense of the threats that are still very prevalent around terrorism. What's your take on the latest report?
The most important thing is the attention that the report has received. The fact that terrorism still remains a challenge, and like the report indicated, it's expanding into more countries. The fact that of the 10 most affected countries, I think about 5, 6 of them within the African sub-region, especially the West African sub-region. The fact that the Sahel region, unfortunately, remains or has emerged as the most affected terrorism challenged region in the world. The fact that groups affiliated with jihadist groups around the world that are affiliated to the two franchises, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, still remain in the forefront of the terrorism challenge. The pathway to radicalization, which they mentioned, that individuals who become radicalized do so more speedily than they used to in the past. The fact that in Europe, as an example, group terrorism has declined, and what we're seeing is individual terrorism. So these are some of the things that I would say is quite instrumental in the counter-terrorism effort that the world has attempted to over the last few years. The fact that after spending so much money, so much effort, we're still dealing with this challenge.
It does appear that terrorism is here to stay, sadly, and worrisomely so. I do know that within the quarters of the Nigerian military, there's been some excitement, so to speak, or maybe not excitement. I'm looking for, will I say, some positivity. And I think maybe that's a better word to use, because it does appear that Nigeria, as I said earlier, was faring better. And maybe what it points to is that we're doing a little more, in trying to curb terrorism back at home, or at least we're able to, reduce the number of fatalities that are, resulting from terrorism. However, given all the other indexes, you've talked about how the Sahelian region is still at the very front, the fast speed of radicalization, is there really much to be positive about?
Definitely. So the report, as you know, is a review of what happened in 2024 that was analyzed, and then the report released. So in 2026, God willing, they would review 2025 and then report it in the index. Now, what it showed in Nigeria is a 38% decrease in incidents, and that's something to be happy about. Sadly, unfortunately, however, in spite of the 38% decrease, we saw a 6% rise in fatalities.
In fatalities?
Yeah. So what the report is saying is less incidents, but then the impact of those incidents have increased. So we're seeing now more mass fatality incidents. So one incident, they gave the example of an incident in Yobe State in 2024 that led to the death of about 120 persons, just one incident. What also came out clearly in that report is the shift from military effort, which is the kinetic effort, to the non-kinetic effort. In other words, of all the recommendations they gave, and for me that's the most important aspect of that report, the last paragraph of the section of Nigeria provided some recommendations, and they did not refer to kinetic effort, which tells me that they are happy with the kinetic effort. They referred to other things outside the kinetic effort. In other words, you're doing fine, the military is doing excellently well, and anyone who is in Nigeria knows the military is doing well. They're taking out the commanders, they're destroying supply chain, that helps the terrorist groups, and several other things. But they are advising that we should shift focus from perhaps maintain the kinetic effort, but then also shift focus to the non-kinetic effort. In the course of the conversation, maybe we'll look at those non-kinetic efforts. But for me, that's the most significant effort. I think there is enough in that report for the military to be happy. But more importantly, our politicians, especially those who are driving the coordinating elements within the national security architecture, need to look carefully at some of the recommendations in that report.
Indeed, I think one of the things that also stood out in the report, I mean, talking about non-kinetic efforts, is the fact that they talk about how terrorism is influenced, particularly in the Sahelian region, influenced by bad governance, pastoral conflicts, and all the other things
Mining,
around.
as an example.
Yeah, so these are the things that are affecting, terrorism, the rise of terrorism in the Sahelian region. And
so in Nigeria specifically, they refer to the socioeconomic conditions. They believe that the socioeconomic conditions is allowing recruitment, and the oxygen that allows terrorism to thrive is rooted in these socioeconomic conditions. If the groups are able to recruit, if they're able to get fuel for their vans to, power whatever it is, factories they have for making bombs and all of that, if they're able to incentivize people with little money to go, and do whatever terrorist activities they want, then they will continue to operate. If they're able to get weaponry from across the border or from wherever it is they're getting those weaponry, then they would continue to carry that activity. So those socioeconomic conditions, and we are all living witnesses to the fact that the socioeconomic conditions in Nigeria have deteriorated. So they are actually saying we should look closely at that. They also, interestingly, talked about Operation Safe Corridor. Operation Safe Corridor, as you know, is the de-radicalization component of the counter-terrorism strategy that we're pursuing. They are commending it. They're saying we should actually expand it because it's a pathway to, reduce the terrorism challenge, as it were. Interestingly, even though they didn't mention the Borno model, but then they talked about pathways to peace. And for me, that's the only model that we have at the moment. The Borno model is instrumental, as it were, to the surrendering of more than 120,000 both members and families of the two terrorist groups. And then the last point which they mentioned, which is also quite instrumental, is the infighting between the two groups. Now, whether that is a strategy or it's just repentance, we should be happy about it. Before, the enemy was facing us. Now they are fighting among themselves, and it's leading to more deaths. In fact, about 60% of the deaths associated with terrorism was actually because of that infighting. So there is a lot to be happy, actually, in that report.
Well, maybe that accounts for why, when you look at the deaths that they're reporting, over 500 deaths, 580-something people lost their lives. You're wondering, but we didn't see that many people reported as a result of terrorism. Kidnapping, banditry, perhaps. Maybe that explains it. But, it's still something that we need to be very concerned about, terrorism. Because as you said, we have the fodder. And I think right now, the military can be happy. The politicians clearly have their work cut out for them, don't they?
They do. So we have three instruments that we use in the country for counterterrorism. The National Counterterrorism Strategy, which is domiciled in the Office of the National Security Advisor. It was launched in 2016. Then the Policy Framework on Countering Violent Extremism, which was launched in 2017, also domiciled in the Office of the National Security Advisor. And then the last one is the Terrorism Prohibition and Prevention Act, as amended in 2022. Now, and the custodian of that document, as it were, is a national document, but the Attorney General of the Federation, I guess, is the arrowhead for the implementation of that. Now, all of these three documents, the prefix associated with them says national. And a point I'm trying to make is, it's not a military thing. It should be an all of society, and all of government, and actually all of nation thing. And I think that is where the deficiency is. Mokwe, I doubt if you go to the market today, and let's say the leader of ISWAP appears in a market, I doubt if a lot of Nigerians will be able to recognize him. And more importantly, I doubt if they know the number to call to say, hey, this is the leader of ISWAP. So that's the deficiency. We've not done much in terms of making Nigerians aware of the contents of these three instruments. Just last week, I think about 17 individuals and a company, including the Lakurawa group, were designated terrorists. Most Nigerians don't even know that we have a sanctions committee that is chaired by the Attorney General of the Federation, whose responsibility it is to facilitate the naming and sanctioning of groups and individuals. So those are the deficiencies. How do we take these instruments that, in fact, are due for a review? Something that was launched in 2016, 2017, by now so many things would have emerged. Cyber crime, the pathway to radicalization that I talked about is actually through the cyberspace. So those documents need to be updated, and more importantly, they need to be taken from the shelves where they are, down to the market woman, down to the media, down to you and I, so that we are the owners of the document. We support their implementation. The oxygen that allows terrorism to thrive, those things that I mentioned earlier on, that we are the ones to block them. It's not actually the federal government. Terrorism happens at the granular level. So we need to take those documents down to the granular level, let the state governors know about them, let them embrace them, let their policies reflect the contents of those documents, let the emerging local government chairman that we want to grant autonomy, let them understand the contents of those documents, so that policies that they come up with also are reflected as part of those three documents. Right now, unfortunately...
And maybe perhaps to the NOA, because the NOA has been doing some work in that regard, trying to let Nigerians know what their rights and responsibilities are. Yeah. But I do know that Ayo also has questions for you. Ayo.
Thank you, Mokwe. You know, perhaps in the same vein, but let's begin here, Mr. Adamu. The military put out a statement condemning, well, casting doubts on the credibility of this report that we are discussing. But what's your take on the military's dismissal of this report?
There are two sides. So the spokesman of the DHQ, when he was asked, did cast doubt on it. But then I remember the Chief of Defense Staff did acknowledge the progress, and in his words said, what happened yesterday, where we are, and then we should be looking at tomorrow. In other words, from that policy point of view, I think he acknowledged the progress that is made in that report. I'm not sure why the spokesperson of the DHQ responded in the manner that he responded. But I think what is more important is for the DHQ, the military, to sit down and have a look at the content of that report. In other words, analyze it in the manner that we've just done, to see the areas where it has made progress. And I mean, point I've made since I started this conversation is that it is not the responsibility of the military alone to address the terrorism challenge. They are one component out of the about 29 ministries, departments, and agencies that we have. So perhaps the coordinating element within our national security sector, the Office of the National Security Advisor, remember we have a coordinator counter-terrorism in that office. And then, of course, the Ministers of Defense, Ministers of Interior, and Police Affairs, and to an extent, the Attorney General of the Federation and the Presidency, perhaps should, come together, look at that report, see the good things in it, and then, of course, the few bad things that are in there, try to contextualize them and see if we need to make any changes. But on the whole, I think the military should be happy with the effort they've made. There is a graph, a very interesting one. I wish your team would show that graph. In that report, it showed where we were in 2007, and then how it peaked around 2011 up until 2013, exactly this graph. You can see how it peaked around 2013, 2014, and then you can see the decline. So the military should be happy about this achievement that it has made. As a country, we shouldn't be happy. I think about 11,000 to 13,000 persons have died over this period, and in no way should we be happy about that. But in terms of the decline, as this linear graph shows, we should be happy, and the military should be happy about it as well.
For me, one of the other issues is, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the granular, which is the people. And it boils down to the local communities. Because when we're talking about terrorism, well, even though there may be domestic or local terrorism, it's usually something that is imported, that comes from outside. So it's those people that I'm thinking we should be giving a little more attention. Yes, you're right, we have made significant progress. I mean, if you saw, there's another graph that I saw, the figures in 2015, beg your pardon, 2014, and even I think 2015, 2016, they were humongous, horrible figures. But now, it's the lowest we have ever seen. And yes, I agree, the military should be celebrating. But at the end of the day, it comes back to people. It comes back to human beings. It comes back to whatever it is that we set up to ensure that these things don't continue. How do you see us doing that? There are those who would preach, look, let's talk about patriotism. Maybe that will help us to own the process more and more. What is your take on how we communicate to the Nigerian, to the local Nigerians in the rural areas about these important conversations?
Mentioning the three instruments that we have: the National Counterterrorism Strategy, the Policy Framework on Countering Violent Extremism, and then the Terrorism Prohibition and Prevention Law as amended in 2022. Now, in these three instruments, there are components of de-radicalization and counter-radicalization. There are components of strategic communication. And like I inferred earlier on, the challenge is that we've left more or less these documents to be gathering dust in the Nigerian parlance on shelves. We've not taken those documents down to the subnationals, down to the even local governments. And more importantly, if you pick one of the documents, the Policy Framework on Countering Violent Extremism, it identified different groups, market groups, student, youths, name them. Everyone has a role as identified in those documents. But sadly, we are not seeing that. The level of engagement has been extremely low. I know there is a strategic communication committee that meets under the auspices of the Office of the National Security Advisor, but we're not seeing the effort and the result of that. So I think that's the way to go. The whole of government should come together, and all the various information instruments that the government has, the Ministry of Information, the National Orientation Agency, the media as a group. You recall this particular National Security Advisor, I remember him going to, I can't remember the exact state, but somewhere in the south, it could have been Akwa Ibom, when he met I think, Guild of Editors, and made a powerful speech. That was immediately after he was appointed. I thought it was a way of engaging with the editors and publishers in a manner that would allow to help in this strategic communication. So I think that's the way to go. Those three documents, those three instruments that I have mentioned, which, by the way, are due for review, we need to break them down so that the average Nigerian understands their content and is able to support in their implementation. It's not really the role of the government to do that. It's all for us Nigerians, and it's only if we're introduced to them and we know the content that we can support them. So again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
But in the context of the world and looking at terrorism globally and the fact that it's still on the rise, and we have had, or we now have, more conflicts than we have had since the end of World War II, what would you be saying to us and to other countries, especially in Africa, which seems to be a weak point, which seems to be suffering the biggest brunt of terrorism? What would you be saying to us as a continent?
So the report identified two reasons for the rise, as it were, in conflicts around the world. Weakness of institutions, interestingly, and then the second one, unfortunately, is the issue around socioeconomic conditions that are driving. And for me also instrumentally is the extractive industry challenge. Now, when you pick all of these three reasons or factors that they've identified, they are domiciled in Africa, as it were. There is no part of Africa, perhaps maybe only South Africa to an extent, is not affected as much by these three instruments. So my message to Africa is to be the man in the mirror situation. Let's be truthful to ourselves. Are we managing our conflicts in the manner that we need to manage them? A silver lining is emerging from Senegal. Most of us did not take notice of that. The Casamance crisis that has been ongoing for decades, a peace deal was signed recently. And why? Because the current president took a different approach. Instead of the adversarial approach, he sat down with them, signed an agreement, and now they're enjoying peace. And of course, that peace would lead to some form of economic growth for that country because of the resources in the Casamance. So maybe we need to sit down and, like I said, be the man in the mirror, be truthful to ourselves. What level of lack of engagement has led to the conflicts that we have? The farmer had violence as an example. At what point did that violence degenerate or morph to what it is at the moment? What are the reasons that led to the morphing of that? So our approach needs to change. The institutions that are responsible for addressing those challenges that frankly have failed, I don't know how to put it better than that. They failed. We need to look at that. How do we strengthen those instruments? How do we make sure? Today in Nigeria, we have ungoverned spaces, whether we want to admit it or not. But there are responsible government institutions for addressing those ungoverned spaces. And what are we doing about it? Nothing. So that's the point. We need to actually look at ourselves in the mirror, tell ourselves the truth, identify those weak points as noted in that report, and then correct them.
Well, we have to thank you very much for your thoughts. You've certainly given us something to think about for the weekend. Thank you so much for coming on the program. Mr. Kabiru Adamu is a global security expert. Thank you once more.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.